our friends at Triumph Publishing have
Hello, this is Paul.
provided that. Paul Guttierez, Doug Miles, and Don Henderson from WTMY and Sports Talk. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Great. We're on the air.
Paul, great to have you on. We're really looking forward to a conversation about the Raiders, and you've got all the numbers for us, so we look forward to it.
Sounds good.
You give the title of the book there, Paul. It's 100 Things Raiders Fans Should Know and Do Before They Die, part of the great series of those 100 Things books. And you're talking to two guys that have followed Raiders football. I go back to maybe the early 70s. Don might have gone to a little before that.
All right. No pressure then, huh?
One question before we get to football. Are you any relation to Guttierez, the shortstop?
No relation. No relation there.
No relation. Okay, go to it, Doug.
Well, you've been covering the Raiders for, ESPN.com, Paul, for a while, and before that for local newspaper?
Yeah, I've covered the Raiders for the Sacramento Bee, for CSNBayArea.com, and ESPN, and actually I just, at the beginning of this season, flipped over to the 49ers. So now I'm currently covering the 49ers, but the book is out. It was written before I made the switch, so.
You went to a better team.
You had quite a game last night.
yeah, exactly. I felt like I'd seen that game before many times in covering the Raiders in Denver.
Well, I know I talked to Doug before we went on the air. He's had a chance to see the book. I have not had a chance to see the book, but he said you do a couple of chapters on the cuff. I never heard of it when it happened. John Gruden, of course, had worked for the Philadelphia Eagles and Buddy Ryan, and I covered the games at that time, so I knew John, and he did a great job out there in Oakland, but the cuff rule beat him.
Yeah, the tuck rule, yeah, definitely.
Give us a little background on that.
Talk a little about the research on not only that, but maybe some of the other things, but that was one of the seminal moments in Raider history, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. The tuck rule, when you talk about the tuck rule, it's not just one of those moments that altered the history of the Raider franchise, in my opinion, but probably the entire league, because if that play happens 13 seconds earlier, then it's not reviewed. The only reason that it was reviewed was because it happened under the 2-minute warning. And still, to his dying day, Al Davis always talked about that there was not this indisputable evidence to overturn the original call of a fumble, because from some angles, it did look like he was pulling the ball in. From other angles, he had his hand on the ball. Other angles, it looked like he was attempting a pass. So they should have stuck with the original ruling. And that, really was the last game that John Gruden coached for the Raiders. He was traded to Tampa Bay a couple of months later, and then that's who the Raiders would face in the Super Bowl the next year. But as Al Davis himself said, and I have it in the book, that tuck rule game was the unraveling of a lot of things that happened. The Raiders got really old quickly. They went to the Super Bowl, and they were humiliated by John Gruden and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and they have not had a winning record or gone back to the playoffs since. So a lot of people look at that as kind of ground zero or the flashpoint for where the Raiders are right now.
Well, Doug and I talked about it just before we went on the air with you, and I have to be very, very, very honest about this, and I've covered football a long time. I never heard of the tuck rule. When that was called, I had no clue as to what it was.
Yeah, and that's the thing today, is that they actually last summer they abolished it, which to the Raiders' chagrin was probably about 11, 12 years too late. And in talking to Lincoln Kennedy, who still works for the team, he's their radio sideline guy, I asked him about that rule and that play, and he said, if that rule doesn't come into effect, who knows if the Raiders go to the Super Bowl, because they would have had to have gone to Pittsburgh the next week anyway for the AFC title game, and who knows what they would have done there. But he said point blank, Bill Belichick is not a Hall of Fame coach. We don't know who Tom Brady is, because if you put yourself back into the context of the time, Tom Brady was just this nice little story, 6th-round draft pick quarterback, because the Patriots had a $100 million man in Drew Bledsoe, and he was going to be the man. But when the tuck rule came into effect and the Patriots took advantage of it and they went all the way to the Super Bowl and upset the greatest show on turf in the St. Louis Rams, well, history kind of took on a different direction at that point.
Doug?
Almost, and you mentioned the Pittsburgh Steelers, too. Raiders had a moment there as well with the Immaculate Reception a few years earlier than that, but two real seminal moments in the history of football, and the Raiders have been part of both of them, and not on their end.
Yeah, and that was the thing. It's almost like if you're a masochistic Raider fan, then you want to read about the tuck rule, you want to read about the Immaculate Reception, the Rob Lytle fumble, non-fumble, things like that. They're all in the book. But the Immaculate Reception, again, is one of those moments that if not for that play, then you're talking about the young Kenny Stabler scrambling for a 30-plus yard touchdown run to beat the Steelers in their first ever playoff game. And then they go and face the undefeated Miami Dolphins, who a lot of people thought hadn't really played anybody all that tough that year. And they thought the Raiders might have been able to give them that first loss that season. So, again, history, hindsight is always 20/20, but it's interesting to go back in those times and talk to the players that were there. And the way Jim Otto remembered it when I talked to him about it, he said the thing that he remembered besides the Immaculate Reception was that was the game in which he had his only career reception. It was a pass that was batted at the line. The old center picked it up and rumbled for a couple of yards, and he said his wife was mad at him that he didn't score a touchdown, because if they score a touchdown on his play, the Immaculate Reception doesn't matter anyway.
Well, I'll tell you, Doug, they were a big underdog when they took on the Philadelphia Eagles and Dick Vermeil. Nobody going into the game, well, not as big as the Miami game, but with the Jets, but they were a big underdog. What do you know about that game?
Yeah, Super Bowl 15. They were the first wild card to come through as a
right.
True wild card and win the Super Bowl. And what was interesting about that was when you're looking at that Philadelphia Eagles team, they're very militaristic, very buttoned up, very businesslike. It burned Dick Vermeil out, and he wouldn't come back for many, many years because of the way that he could approach coaching. And the Raiders, of course, they were the wild boys. They were the self-proclaimed badasses of the 70s who never knew a rule that they didn't break. So, John Matuzek's out there on Bourbon Street breaking curfew every night, and I guess he gets on the bus before a practice, and Tom Flores asks him, what are you doing? Why were you out breaking curfew? So, no, Coach, I wasn't breaking curfew. I was out making sure other guys weren't. So I was just out there monitoring for you. So it was things like that would happen that week. Rod Martin told me that they had a lot of pressure on themselves because had they not beaten the Eagles, every other team, as you know, the NFL is such a copycat league, every other team would have then followed the Eagles' example of being buttoned up, follow all the rules, no straying outside of the line. So they felt like they had a lot of pressure from the other, at the time, 27 teams in the NFL to beat Vermeil and show that that's not the way to coach a team.
Well, we'll let Doug get in with another question in a second. I just want to follow that one up with I was with the Eagles in those days, and when you talk buttoned up, that was what Dick Vermeil was all about. He believed in regimentation and his system. And listen, Dick's a great guy, great coach, and proved later on when he won the Super Bowl that a lot of the things that he did were correct. It just didn't happen to work that weekend.
Exactly, yeah. And besides that game was really the Cinderella or the Lazarus story, if you will, of Jim Plunkett. The guy was basically out of the game a year and a half earlier. And because Dan Pastorini broke a leg in week 5, Jim Plunkett was able to come back and resuscitate his career and lead them to the Super Bowl. And, many people thought that Rod Martin probably should have been the MVP of that Super Bowl with the 3 interceptions. But I don't think anybody's going to argue that Jim Plunkett was the true inspirational story of that Super Bowl. And, he did it again when they were in L.A. 3 years later, helping to lead that team with Marcus Allen, of course, as his running back. But, Jim Plunkett's one of the great comeback stories in NFL history, in my opinion, and should get more Hall of Fame consideration simply because of his story, He and
Earl Morrall. Earl Morrall.
Yeah.
They were two great stories when you come to the Super Bowl.
Definitely, and Jim Plunkett did. He wrote the forward for me, so I guess what I'm talking about, the full disclosure, he did do the forward for me, and I understand what his story is, and it's really interesting, and the book was really told and kind of weaved through the stories, the words, the voice of not only Jim Plunkett but Tom Flores, because to me it's really hard to separate those two. They're so intrinsically linked when it comes to not only their history but the history of the Raiders as well.
Yeah, let's talk about some of those. You talk about the great coaches of football, and Raiders have had a few of them there. Of course, John Madden. Actually, Al Davis started as their head coach out there. But let's talk about John Madden first. I guess you had a chance to talk to him quite a bit, covering the team over the years, or maybe as a broadcaster afterward. Real character of the game when he became a broadcaster. But I remember him on the sidelines. He was a character too.
Yeah, and he was he was basically the youngest coach that Al Davis had hired at that point in time, and he was really an unknown linebacker coach. And when you go back and you look at it, he was the only defensive-minded coach that Al Davis ever hired. And the way Al Davis talked about it was that they were both young guys, they were crazy, they were cocky, but they understood that there was a certain dynamic that had to exist between the two of them. And it was interesting going back and doing the research of their relationship between them, and that in later years, when Al Davis was getting on in age, you always heard that, well, whoever's the head coach is a puppet anyway. Well, going back, that reputation preceded the guys in the late 90s and the early 2000s. I mean, it was there with John Madden. People thought that Al Davis was the true coach, and going back, and John Madden himself said, no, I'm the coach, and we do have conversations, and Al Davis was unique in that he was a pure football mind as an owner, as a GM. So as John Madden went, so did Al Davis, and it kind of followed on with Tom Flores as well, who was the first quarterback in Oakland Raiders history too. So when it comes to Madden, I mean, I don't think there's any outside of Al Davis, probably not another person so closely associated with the singular team as John Madden is with the Raiders.
Well, give us the dynamics of the Oakland Raiders and the success. The California Raiders, when he bucked the league and decided he was going to move the ball club to L.A., and that sort of fizzled, and then they finally decided to come back, and it seems to me that it's been in a state of flux ever since then.
Yeah, and I talked to Howie Long about that, and he said, they're not Oakland's Raiders, they're not LA's Raiders, they're just like this ship that's afloat at sea, and yet it has this phenomenal fan base that is extremely loyal, almost to a fault, and it's a shame that they can't really drop anchor, so to speak, and fix it. I mean, you see it today. I mean, in all honesty, you don't know where the Raiders are going to play next year. Mark Davis, Al's son, has said time and time again that he wants something to happen in Oakland. He wants something to happen in the East Bay. L.A. beckons. Even in his last days, Al Davis said, well, if L.A. can build a stadium, they know they can always knock on the door. So it's real interesting to see what's going to happen with this franchise. And shockingly, I think 0-16 this year with this team is a possibility, and it's something that Al Davis never would have dreamed of. So it really does kind of go back to not really setting up. They did break a lot of fans' hearts when they went to L.A., and now L.A. still believes that the Raiders belong to them. So, and it's been over 20 years now. So they really need to figure out exactly what they're going to do with the stadium and where their home is going to be for the long term.
Paul, do you think, was it a case of just Al Davis being so rigid the last 10 or 15 years of doing it his way alone that they've fallen apart? Has it been a combination of other things? And how much is Mark Davis? Is he the kind of guy that you think that can turn it around?
Well, I think that to answer the first part of the question, I could obviously everybody has their own opinion as to did the game simply pass Al Davis by, and many would say that it did. But in talking to those that were his closest lieutenants at the time, and Tom Flores was definitely one of them, he told me, and it's in the book, that where Al kind of fell behind in the wayside in his later years was he didn't have one of those top lieutenants next to him the last 10, 15 or so years. He just basically ran the thing all by himself. And it was just too much. The league simply passed him by. He didn't have a GM like Bruce Allen next to him. He didn't have a Tom Flores. He didn't have a John Madden there on a daily basis. Now, he could reach out to those guys if he wanted, but he was such a proud man, and he figured that he knew exactly what to do, that he didn't do that. He just kept doing things on his own, and you saw what happened there. Mark, on the other hand, he's obviously his father's son, and he gleaned a lot of things from being around, but he's not a football mind like Al Davis was. Nobody is. But what impressed me the most about Mark was in his introductory press conference when he said, you know what, I don't know a lot, but I know what I don't know, so I need to surround myself with good football people, good football minds, and then we'll get this thing back up and running the way that it should be.
Yeah.
Well, the only thing I've never understood is, and whether with the Oakland A's and their great years and all the great times they had out there, or the Raiders and their great times, seems like nobody wants to be in Oakland. I mean, is it that bad?
It can be, and yet the strange thing about it is where the Coliseum currently sits, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many, is actually the best site for a new stadium in the Bay Area. In covering the 49ers, I call them the Santa Clara 49ers because that's where their home base is. That's where the stadium is. It's a gorgeous, unbelievably modern stadium, but it's not San Francisco, and it's hard to get to. It's not off of the freeway. You got to drive through some city streets to get there. Where the Coliseum is, it's right off the freeway. There's the BART system. There's trains. There's everything right there. And that's Mark Davis's ultimate dream, is to build what they've termed Coliseum City, where there's enough room there to build a football stadium in one end of a parking lot and a baseball stadium for the A's in another end of the parking lot, and then put all kinds of shopping and motels, hotels, apartment buildings, condos, things like that in there. But the market is so depressed right now that nobody knows where that type of money can come from. So it seems like it's a pie in the sky type of a dream right now, but it's a good idea. I'm just not so sure that you can get much, if anything, done in California right now with the current economic status. And the fact that the 49ers were able to get it done in Santa Clara, that was just more kudos to them for being able to pull it off.
Well, that's the exact same problem that the Tampa Bay Rays are having here, is the fact that the state of Florida just has no revenue. I will say one thing. I was there during the playoffs when the earthquake hit. That didn't make me feel too good.
Yeah, and we had one here in late August as well. It was actually centered in Napa, wine country, which is where the Raiders do training camp in the summer. So, and where I live is about 30 miles from there. So it woke us up and gave us a pretty good little shake in the morning.
Where are you from out there?
We're in Petaluma, which is about an hour north of San Francisco, Oakland. So we live in my wife's hometown. Yeah, so it's a nice community.
You still have the arm
we just did the wine country last year. It's very nice out there in Napa and around there.
Yeah, the wine country, Sonoma County, arm wrestling, cow tipping, whatever you want to find. I'm sure you could get yourself into here.
Used to be in Wild World of Sports.
Dick Vermeil's got his wine shop out there. So
that's right. Yeah, he's here. Tom Seaver has a winery up here. Glenn Carano, I believe, has a wine up here too. Charles Woodson, that's one of the things in the book of the 100 things to know and do is to drink Charles Woodson's wine, and he has a wine that he has made up there in Napa. So,
well, Paul, appreciate you taking some time. I know you're right in the middle of football season, covering the Niners now, but this book for any football fan, anybody that grew up with the classic Raider teams, 100 Things Raiders fans should know and do before they die. Of course, Triumph Books puts it out. You have a website you want to direct people to, or just the Triumph website? Yeah,
the Triumph website. You can find it on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, or if you're on Twitter, you can find me on Twitter, and there's links to the book there as well. And my Twitter handle is @PGuttierez ESPN. So thank you guys for the time, and it was, like I said, it was a labor of love, and it was a lot of fun.
Before you go, Paul, now they're with the 49ers. What's the situation there? Because Harbaugh's taking a lot of heat.
Yeah, Harbaugh.
I'll leave you guys with this. And as you guys know, in radio and in any media, this is called a tease, right? It would not shock me if Jim Harbaugh were the Raider coach next year. I'm just going to leave it at that.
All right.
Oh, how about that?
We'll have you back on.
Good enough. Thank you so much for joining us.
All right, thank you guys. Take care.